for tonight's event with Tim Carney, featuring his new book, Alienated America, Why Some Places Thrive While Others Collapse. As most of you know, Tim is the commentary editor at Washington Examiner and a visiting fellow at AEI. His articles have been published and he appears regularly on all your favorite news stations, even some of the fake news outlets. I'm guessing half of you are here tonight because you've already read this book and you want to hear more from Tim, you want to ask him questions. The other half of you are here because someone told you you had to read this book, and so you're here dutifully to get more information on it. It's really captured the attention, not only of just the DC circuit, but of people all over the country, for whom this discussion about isolation and atomization in our lives really hits home. And it's true that anecdote, the plural of anecdote, is not data, but this book really is chock full of both, really making the case for the importance of the little platoons in society between the individual and the state. Probably the most disturbing statistic I found in the book was that it was in the 1940s that 90% of all booze and beer was consumed in bars, and by the 1990s that had dropped to 40%. So I really encourage all of you to do your part to fix that trend in the reception afterwards. But in the meantime, please join me in welcoming Tim Carney.
Thank you, Mitch. Thank all of you for coming. This is an especially exciting thing for me. The book came out 2 months ago, but this stop is exciting because I know so many of you have known you for years. It's the first one that my wife, Katie, has been able to come to, so thank you. She's put up with a lot with my travel. But also, I think this is my fourth time standing in this spot, facing in this direction. The first one was 15 years ago this week when I entered into the Catholic Church, receiving my first communion and confirmation in this spot. And the second one was I gave a talk here on the threats to religious liberty. This was in 2011 when the Hobby Lobby case was in its infancy. And the third one was up here with a guy named Philip Blond, a British author who is writing about the collapse of civil society and local community in the UK and broadly in the West. All three of those, my entrance into the church, the threats to religious liberty, and the collapse of civil society are central, are the elements of what made Alienated America come into being. And the book is a story about the American dream, about the perception that the American dream is dead. So it's a story about work, it's a story about faith, it's a story about family, it's a story about place. It's a story about community, obviously. But it's also a story about how Donald Trump became the President of the United States. And because I'm a political reporter, as Mitch mentioned, my story begins in Iowa. And because I'm a good Irish Catholic, my story begins in a bar. It was Joe's Place in Iowa City a few weeks before the 2015 convention. 2016 caucuses, and I was in a bar and I met this couple, middle-aged couple, and they both worked at the university, and she was from Iowa. And so I said, where? She said, Orange City. Again, I'm an Irish Catholic, and the color orange can trigger me sometimes. So I said, what exactly does the orange stand for in Orange City? And she said, oh, it has to do with our being Dutch. I said, just how Dutch is Orange City? So this woman named Holly Vander something said, let me put it to you this way. I used to walk in clogs past Windmill Square during the Tulip Parade. And, as she went on, it started to sound like a Simpsons episode send-up of Dutch people in the Midwest. So I had to go there. So I travel out to Sioux County. And sure enough, the welcome to Orange City sign is the shape of a clog. It's a Dutchess county in all of America. About 50% of the population there reports Dutch ancestry on the U.S. Census. And I went to Orange City and to Sioux Center, where I attended a Jeb Bush rally at a Christian college called Dordt. And I ran into a couple things there. One, yes, everybody was Dutch. The first woman I met was named Wilhelmina, which is the name of the Queen of the Netherlands during the World Wars. But also, among this conservative crowd, there was before the caucuses, remember, there was a strong antipathy to Donald Trump. Politically, this isn't about Trump, but this was sort of my wayfinding, the way that I searched out certain types of places it really helped to look at places like this that in the general election would vote for Trump, as Sioux County definitely did over Hillary Clinton. But in the early caucuses, when they had 17 options, there just wasn't the enthusiasm for him there that there was in the rest of rural Iowa. And when I asked around why, there was lots of explanations. But one pastor told me that 900 congregants, only one was backing Trump in the caucuses. And sure enough, Trump bombed in the caucuses there. His single worst county in the whole state was Sioux County, the Dutchess County, also probably the most conservative county in the whole state. He got 11%. His other two counties were Marion and Lyon County. Marion has Pella. Lyon is a neighboring county to Sioux, very Dutch. So we political analysts, we talk about the Hispanic vote. You talk about the Cuban vote. There's a Mormon vote. So I was starting to realize there was a Dutch vote, and what was going on here. Ted Cruz, I asked him. I said, "Why did you do so well in the Dutch places?" And he said, "Well, these are really nice people, Tim, and they don't like Donald. They want somebody who's really nice, like Ted Cruz, apparently." I didn't necessarily buy that explanation. Somebody else posited that they were upset at Trump, the Dutch were upset at Trump for appropriating the color orange. Sure enough, you looked at the Michigan primaries, and Western Michigan, where Holland is, was Donald Trump's worst part of Michigan in the primaries, by far. So there's 4 counties out there, they were all his worst. The Dutchess municipality in America was his worst precinct in all of Michigan. So what was going on? When I talked to the people at Dordt College, one liberal guy who's a husband of a professor said, "Well, the thing about people out here is they vote right and live left." So at this point, I thought I had like a really big story. What is going on out here in Orange County? Are they all pot-smoking swingers? What does live left mean? He said, no, people here, they look out for their neighbors. They take care of their environment. They just don't rely on the government to do it. And I was really annoyed at that description of living left, but I set that aside to take his observation of what was going on. So I had to figure it out firsthand, so I went out to Oostburg, Wisconsin. And when I landed there, what should have been obvious became obvious. I sat down at Judy's Diner on a Sunday, and sure enough, in come the people from families pouring from the 9 o'clock service at First Reformed Church and the Bethel Orthodox Presbyterian Church. And then, in this village of 2,000, in come all the families from the 9:15 First Presbyterian Church. And it was tricky for me because their church takes longer than an hour, so I was a little confused by that. But yes, even on an average Sunday, it was going on for 2 hours. And then in came the people from the 9:30 services at the First Christian Reformed Church. 4 Reformed churches in a village of 2,000. So the live left comment was really about the strong social trust, the strong sense of duty to one's neighbor that exists in these Dutch places, whether it's Western Michigan, Orange County, or Oostburg. And that strong social cohesion and the good outcomes that you find in these places were directly related to the churches and the other institutions they had set up. Christian colleges, charities that had been started by successful people in these businesses, strong institutions of civil society that had been built. And so these Reformed churches had planted themselves throughout the plains, created these strong communities where there wasn't all the maladies that were plaguing so much of rural America and middle America: economic, social, drug addiction, high school dropout, teenage pregnancies. And in these places, the American dream seemed alive and well. So when Donald Trump came down the escalator and said the American dream is dead, that resonated over much of rural America, but it didn't resonate in these places. And it wasn't the Dutch, of course. The same was true in Mormon, Utah. And we saw it closer to home in Silver Spring. Donald Trump won most of Silver Spring. He lost 2 precincts. If any of you guys know Silver Spring, there's a road called Arcola Avenue and a road called Kemp Mill. There is a fairly conservative, modern Orthodox synagogue on Kemp Mill Road, and then there's a more conservative, more Orthodox synagogue on Arcola Avenue. 2 voting precincts, very Orthodox Jewish, and they were the 2 that voted for Ted Cruz in the primaries. So, hence the section in my book titled Jews for Cruz. So, that's a strong religious conservatives living in these places where the American dream seemed live, community was strong, outcomes were good. But that wasn't the only place. Quick note on living in Silver Spring. We have 6 children, And so it would happen occasionally that when Katie would go into the grocery stores in these parts of Silver Spring, she would, if she had many of our children in tow, she would immediately be directed to the kosher food aisle, which of course is better than in the average grocery store. You show up with 6 kids, they send you to the family planning aisle. But it wasn't just the religious places. The elites were the other places where we saw this electoral pattern. Same-day crews carried those Orthodox precincts. I had spent the morning down the road in the village of Chevy Chase. Chevy Chase is the wealthiest municipality. So this isn't like a lesser Chevy Chase. If you guys live in the town of Chevy Chase, that's not the village of Chevy Chase, or Chevy Chase Section 5, where Brett Kavanaugh came from. This is a village. The wealthiest municipality in the wealthiest region in the wealthiest country in the history of the world. Like the village of Oostburg, population about 2,000. 10 times the average home price of the village of Oostburg. It's $1.5 million in Chevy Chase. Trump, who got 54% statewide and who won Montgomery County, got only 16% in Chevy Chase. The elites also rejected Trump. It's the same thing in Michigan. Grosse Pointe, Ann Arbor rejected Trump. Same thing in Wisconsin. Waukesha, Ozaukee, Washington, the more educated, wealthier places. So here it's important, especially for conservative Christians and conservative Catholics in this crowd, to clarify, to set aside a myth. There is a myth, I call it the Lena Dunham fallacy, the belief that our liberal elites are all living totally decadent lives. The truth is that if you look at the numbers, the places like Chevy Chase have very low levels of divorce, have very high levels of intact families. People are getting married, staying married, being involved in their kids' lives, and then staying involved in their communities. Now, they won't admit it, they won't preach it, and they'll push policies that undermine it for the rest of the country, but this is what works. This is the way human nature is made, is that you have best outcomes if you live that way. And the elites, whether they call them best practices or whatever, that's in general what they follow. And so these two types of places that have these good outcomes, the elite communities and the religious communities, the Chevy Chases and the Oostburgs, they aren't, my thesis is, they're not two different types of communities. They're one. They are the places with very strong institutions of civil society that bring people together, that give you a human level safety net, that give you a sense of purpose. And this creates the infrastructure that makes family rearing possible, that makes it possible to find your own purpose, your own meaning in life, that makes growing up into adulthood, provides you with the guidance to do it. The good life is dependent on these strong institutions of civil society. This is the way we are made. This is the way we are created. And these institutions are increasingly eroding in most of America. And where they are present, the Chevy Chases and the Oostburgs, Americans are doing very well. Where they're not, Americans were not doing as well. Outcomes were poor. The American dream seemed dead. And Donald Trump was a rare politician who was willing to say that. And those were the places that he won. So the affliction of the American working class, the reason that we have so much struggle there is because of the collapse of the little platoons. Economic explanations are certainly involved. I think they're often the first domino. But any explanation, the New York Times explanation, oh, this is a bunch of angry old white guys upset they're losing their privilege, that discounts that something real was actually lost and not merely privilege. And the purely economic explanations that it was just about a factory shut down misses the middle steps, which is the closure of and the loss of these important institutions of civil society. So why exactly is community so important? Sometimes it can be difficult speaking to when I speak on a college campus, or I speak in a setting like this where people are plugged into religious organizations. Sometimes it can be difficult to convey it, because for so many of us, strong community bonds are the air that we breathe. It's explaining water to a fish. But the truth is that if you belong to a parish, if you belong to some other religious institution, if you belong to Opus Dei, I see a couple TFP people, you belong to these institutions, you know the value of them. But some people, especially young people who are brought up with their parents packing them into these institutions, and then they go off to college where they're engaged in a joint higher pursuit of a higher good. You're living in it, and it can be easy to miss. The story I tell in the very beginning of Alienated America is the story of our daughter Eve. When she was 1, she ended up in Children's Hospital, so with difficulty breathing. And after a while, it became clear that the sort of magical breathing machine at the hospital was going to be fine, take care of her, and we would just be stuck in the hospital for a few days. And so, inconvenient. I had a job, 2 jobs. We have 5 other kids, lots of stuff going on. And we got flooded with so much support. One of our oldest son read this section. He said, "You should have said the part about the sandwiches." I said, "What part about the sandwich?" He said, "That week at lunch, every kid at the Heights envied my lunch because we had the best sandwiches for 1 week." And it's because people were bringing us so much food. And so what I write in the preface, sitting in the pediatric intensive care unit at 3 a.m., as I thought about each person or couple who helped us or wrote or called, I noticed these weren't simple bilateral relationships. In almost every case, there was an institution that linked us. Again, this wasn't how we thought about our friends generally. They were just our friends. But whenever I described to others the help we got, I found myself speaking of the couple from our parish or the family from our pool. Some help came from parents at our same boys' school where our oldest sons go. Others were my college classmates. Others were work colleagues at the Examiner or the American Enterprise Institute. Parents of kids I had coached in baseball helped. The woman who sent the Corner Bakery feast is in my wife's book club and attends the same Virginia parish as my wife's parents. The Grubhub gift card came from an organization on whose board I had sat. So that safety net, the human level safety net that you've enjoyed if things have gone wrong in your life or if you've had a baby, that comes not just from having friends, but often from being plugged into an institution through which you have friends. But it's not just what's below. It also provides a sense of purpose. These institutions call on you to do stuff. And so, for instance, for me, a couple years ago, a little over a year ago, I got called on to coach kindergarten girls basketball. Now, kindergarten basketball should not exist, all right? The only reason it exists is because these girls running around look cute running around in their basketball shorts and a basketball. Like, you don't need a coach to look cute running around. So I get this call saying there's, 8 girls from our parish, kindergarten girls from our parish signed up for basketball in the county rec league. They need a coach. Can you do it? And I began to answer no, I'm any year, but this year I'm really busy. Oh, what are you busy with? I'm writing a book about the importance of community and So I coached kindergarten girls basketball. But that's the thing. I never have a feeling of purposelessness because I'm being called on to do things by these institutions I belong to. So much of the working class, my boss at AEI, Arthur Brooks, says it's men who feel that they don't have a purpose, that if they have a job, it's sort of hit or miss. And that's, if you look at opioid epidemic, I think a lot of that is there. Also, lots of researchers show, and I'll breeze through this, but we can talk about it if you're curious, upward mobility. The 2 biggest factors are the percentage of intact families and the denseness of social ties in a community, are the biggest predictors of children raised in poverty rising up out of it. So these little platoons are the beating heart of the American dream. They always have been. But in so much of the country, these little platoons are eroding. So what's going on in the places where the American dream seems dead? So one of the things I do, my colleague Byron York came up with this term for one of the things I do professionally. He called it bar reporting. This is where you go to a bar and you talk to voters. And I found over my first, the 2004, 2006, 2008 election cycles that some bars were a lot better than others. Hotel bars, too many out-of-towners. College bars, they don't vote. You end up and through a lot of the elections, you'd go to a roadside country bar, and the answer to every question is, politics is just a bunch of BS, blah, blah, blah. And so yuppie Irish pubs became my sweet spot. You had Republicans, you had Democrats, men, women, old, youngish. And you often had like the man was voting for Obama and his wife was voting for Romney, and it made great stories, right? 2016 comes around, you need to go back to those roadside country bars, because the Yuppie Irish Pub, if they have Republicans, they're all Kasich, Cruz, or Rubio Republicans. And the same people in the country roadside Irish pub are saying, I don't follow politics, it's all a bunch of BS. We're now saying in 2016, it's all a bunch of BS, and that's why I'm voting for Donald Trump. So I ended up in Fayette County, Pennsylvania. I picked that county south of Pittsburgh because I found a study showing the drop-off in religious attendance in counties in Pennsylvania. And the biggest drop-off for evangelicals and Catholics was in Fayette County. So I went to Uniontown. And one tool that makes bar reporting a lot easier is Yelp. And so I end up at a roadside bar called Smitty's. It's the same thing. It's outside of town. Everybody has to drive. Not ideal for a bar. Gravel parking lot, like no windows in the front, so it's kind of dark and dreary inside. I've been to that type of place a dozen times. I picked it because it was also reviewed for having the best wings, and chicken wings are basically my favorite food. So I went inside there, and the politics was what you'd expect. Everybody in Smitty's was white. They were all voting for Trump. Half of them were Democrats, half of them were independents. Basically, none of them were voting for Pat Toomey. He was one of my favorite politicians. He was the epitome of the untrustworthy guy because he was both a banker and a politician. And so I'm there, and I'm talking to these guys, and when I asked them, I said, why do you think the economy is so bad here? Well, the steel mill shut down, but why aren't businesses coming back? And a couple of them were like, well, part of the problem is a work ethic, right? Like, there's so many welfare cheats here, and they're going on, and you get to these stories, they're always third-hand stories you hear in every bar. Well, this woman, she was getting a T-bone steak, and then when she tried to get dog food, they said she couldn't use her food stamps, so she then got a second T-bone steak and said, Rufus is going to eat well tonight. All these stories about this, and there's a racial undercurrent to these stories. So at some point, it's like 2:30 on a Tuesday, and all these guys are complaining about lazy people who don't work. Now, again, this is my job, so I'm supposed to be sitting at the bar at 2:30 on a Tuesday, okay? So I turn to this one guy, and I say, Dave, you don't work. You're not retired like Bob over here. He goes, no, I'm on disability. And then he rattles off all his back surgeries, and it's just excruciating. Lower back, very debilitating. And I said, oh, so in Uniontown, there aren't really sort of desk jobs you could do, I guess. And he said, no, I can't sit in a chair for more than 30 minutes without being in excruciating pain. I said, Dave, you've been sitting at this bar stool for an hour and a half. And Dave looks right at me and he says, well, today I'm numb because my son died this morning. So the stories, the numbers of the suffering of the working class in the rural America, the things that someone like me had thought of as sociological data, and that columnist for the New York Times had said was just bitterness of old men losing their privilege. I was staring it in its face in this dark pub in Uniontown. And yeah, Fayette County has a overdose death 50% higher than the rest of the state, which is twice as high as the rest of the country. And suicides are on their way up in America, hit the highest level ever last year, and rural counties are leading the charge in that. And I think it's all the fruit of alienation. It's loneliness is a way you could put on a personal level. Disconnectedness. Psychiatrist Aaron Carney explained the rise in white middle-aged suicides by saying, quote, we are not living in community anymore. We're living in isolation. We don't have people to provide meaning and give hope. I think this is true on opioids as well. It's also the root of lots of the collapse of communities, the roots of lots of other ills. The retreat from marriage, I think, is directly linked to that. A wise woman once said, it takes a village to raise a child. We've experienced that very much firsthand repeatedly, the need for neighbors, the need for parish, the need for community, the need for friends to raise children. And when we talk about institutions of civil society, of course, to go back to Oostburg for a second, for the middle class and the working class in America, the main institution of civil society has always been church. Church produces good outcomes. Kids who go to church are less delinquent, less violent. Couples who go to church are less likely to get divorced. Men who go to church are less likely to be abusive. Lots of strong positive things. But the one way to look at it, if you're looking at it from a secular perspective, because this is true across churches for the most part, with some exceptions, is that for the middle class and the working class, if they're going to belong to something, it's mostly going to be church. Robert Putnam wrote Bowling Alone, and and talked about bowling leagues and all these things, and then almost as a footnote says, half of all civic activity originates in a church. And so a secularizing country is manageable, survivable for the elites who can be plugged into country clubs and strong public schools and all that. For the middle class and working class, especially middle America, secularizing country means alienation, and it means death and despair. So what are the root causes of this? Over-centralization of government and of our attention. Government crowding out of charity is a real thing, and when all our attention gets sucked into CNN and whether Michael Cohen or Michael Avenatti is the worst Michael lawyer caught up in this thing that doesn't affect our real life, our attention is dragged away from what's near at hand, from the things where we can have an actual impact. But also hyper-individualism is a big problem. Technology that draws us into our own little worlds and away from other people. One species of hyper-individualism is the sexual revolution that divorces, that makes sex not linked to marriage and family formation, that makes marriage sort of contractual relationship between two people rather than a permanent bond made with God and with a community. That those are species of hyper-individualism that undermine the strength of community. And for a lot of people, these things are at the heart of their understanding of the American dream. That individualism, that not really being tied down to anything. You can be whatever you want. Those are all good things, but taken to their extreme, it means severing of all bonds, severing of all duties. But that hyper-individualism and that over-centralization can sound like opposite things. But if you've read your Alexis de Tocqueville, you know that they're two sides of the same coin. That phrase, two sides of the same coin, I actually got from Yuval Levin, an excellent book he wrote called Fractured Republic, but just lays that out. The more the state grows, the more the vertical bonds are strengthened through law and regulation, the more the horizontal bonds among people are weakened. But most particularly, Tocqueville argues, the state does not want any rivals, and the institutions are the main rivals. It's not the individual versus a collective. That's the sort of elementary school version of it that Ayn Rand gives us. It's the community versus the centralized state that's the real battle here. And the apotheosis of centralization leading to individualism, when I give a slideshow of this in colleges, I show the brilliant slideshow from the 2012 election, The Life of Julia. I don't know if you guys remember this from Obama, where this faceless girl is standing in her bedroom and it explains, under President Obama, Julia gets Head Start and da-da-da, and then she's like the only girl standing in a high school. Under President Obama, she's able to take the essay, and she's the only girl graduating from her college. There's no other human beings in this until there's a slide. Under President Obama, Julia decides to have a child. So this is some sort of different kind of virgin birth going on under President Obama, where Obamacare is the Holy Spirit in this version. But the state takes care of her along every step of the way, so she never needs another human being, so she never gets to interact with another human being. And again, the Life of Julia that decides to have a child slide was the justification of the contraceptive mandate, which, again, I'm very happy. Some of you were here 7 years ago today. I think Adrian was sitting in that same seat 7 years ago when I was talking about this. The administration's argument in the contraceptive mandate, in the Hobby Lobby case, in Little Sisters of the Poor, the Obama administration's argument was that you sacrifice your right to have free exercise of religion the moment you enter into commerce. This is a subspecies of a broader effort to drive the church out of the public square. Not to eliminate the church, but just to make the church retreat into a little chapel. As Nancy Pelosi said when attacking the Little Sisters of the Poor, she was asked questions, how does this jive with your Catholic faith? She said, look, I do my religion on Sundays. She then added, well, other days of the week when I try to go to church, and I had to admire that. Like, if she's going to church repeatedly during the week, that's good. But you can't do your religion just in Mass. You can't do your religion just on Sundays. But that is the effort, the secularization effort, when you think about the desire to increase the size of the government, and then this absolutist teaching of the separation of church and state. They want the state to be everything. They want to separate church and state. They want to allow us to have the buildings we have and Sunday morning for an hour. Chasing the church from the public square is devastating because the church is the central institution of civil society. If you care about the poor and the working class, you cannot chase the church from the public square. You've got to actually scold our church, a Catholic church, for not doing more of the corporal works of mercy, for not going out there and being more of a force in the world. That's what you should be doing instead of trying to chase them out of the public square. I want to get to questions, so quickly, solutions. Like the Ten Commandments, about half of my solutions here are thou shalt not. Because you're supposed to have solutions. I'm a conservative. I'm not great at solutions, right? My first book, it was about corporate welfare, and the criticism of it, that one person said, a friend of ours, J.P. Frere, said, this book is like sugar subsidies bad, export-import bank bad, ethanol bad, and then the index. He was expecting there to be, here's how to fix it. So then my second book, I had a solutions chapter, and I read it before writing this solutions chapter. And my solutions chapter in my second book, I was like, I don't agree with half of this. This was all a lot of real bad ideas. I was going to somehow solve corporate welfare with a gold standard. I think that's a horrible idea. Don't ask about the gold standard in the question period. We're not talking about that. Anyway, so a lot of thou shalt nots, but there are other things. And usually my audience has better ideas. But walkable communities is one thing local politicians can look into. Federal tax code shouldn't subsidize bigger houses. Nothing against bigger houses, but driving people into them is not shouldn't be a government policy. Local control of public schools, unions. And I think you were one of the first people who pointed me to this sort of Northern European model of unions. I mentioned that in the book, where they are more institutions of civil society. We can talk about it. Ultimately, no big solution is possible because centralization is part of the problem. So what can fix this? So here every good story should come home in the end. Here I want to come home in a couple different ways. First, I had mentioned the synagogues on Arcola Avenue and Kent Mill in Silver Spring. If you've been there, you know right at the intersection of Arcola Avenue and Kent Mill is St. Andrew Apostle Parish. That's our parish. I coach T-ball there. The reason, again, T-ball, not necessarily the most important sport in the world, but I coach it as a sort of almost excuse to have a parish picnic on Fridays. And the other day I was teaching the kids to throw. One thing about T-ball, you can't have them try to have a catch because they can neither throw nor catch. So you have to isolate them. So I had them throw the ball against the back of the backstop, and there was this plaque there, and I said, aim at that plaque. And I thought, I've never actually read this plaque. And I walked up, and I don't know if you remember the guy's first name. It was like, it said Detoli's Diamond. It said, Mike Detoli, dedicated himself to CYO sports at St. Andrews. He died in his 50s. But I thought about that, and I thought, that'd be a pretty good thing to get your name on one of those plaques. And the playing field is called the Terrence McCardle playing field. This was a kid who had dropped out of college, didn't have a purpose in life, started being the defensive coordinator for St. Andrews football teams. And if you look on the back of my daughter's CYO basketball jersey, it's got the name Al Weaver. I never met any of these guys. Al Weaver was a guy who spent 50 years giving his time to St. Andrews. I talk about these because so many times, if I speak on a campus, the auditorium is named after somebody who gave $1 million. And if you go to Western Michigan, that I talk about in this book, so many things named Van Andel and DeVos, etc. And that's great that they're building libraries. They are using their billions to build institutions of civil society. That's what you should do with your billions. But most of you aren't going to have billions. Most people are going to have some time. They're going to be a member of a community. They can be more like, you all can be more like Mike Detoli and Terrence McCardle and Al Weaver. And that, frankly, is going to be a large part of the solution, is people like the people in this room doing that. And I talked about the free exercise of religion. And I So to come right back to this room, I came into the church 15 years ago this week, and that week was the first time that I kind of realized that you look at the statues in the stained glass windows, honoring men, similar to how we have the plaques there. We Catholics are big into reminding us about saints, and I sort of hadn't thought about the fact that it was now my job to try to become a saint. And so how to do that. So obviously many people much more qualified than I have written about this, but there's a pretty good passage in the Bible, Luke 10, and I'll end with this. There was a scholar of the law who stood up to test him and said, "Teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" Jesus said to him, "What is written in the law? How do you read it?" He said in reply, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your being, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." He replied to him, "You have answered correctly. Do this and you will live." But because he wished to justify himself, he said to Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" Jesus replied, and then he tells a Good Samaritan story. So Good Samaritan story is a story about, it's a foreigner, actually, who does it. But he helps the man, he's the one who's physically proximate. The answer is not everybody in the world is your neighbor. G.K. Chesterton writes brilliantly about that. The breadth of your compassion is inversely proportional to the depth of it, right? But the person who's physically there with you, you have to love them. And you love them with these corporal works of mercy. He nurses him back to health. He carries him. He donates his own money when he does have to leave for somebody else to continue the care. So Barack Obama used to like to say, well, I believe in the freedom of worship. Freedom of worship is not in the Constitution. It's free exercise of religion. And you can't exercise your religion on Sundays, as Nancy Pelosi proposes. To exercise your religion, to try to become a saint, is to love your neighbor. And to love your neighbor is to serve the people who are physically proximate to you, that you have ability to do that. And the fact is, the best way to do that is by building up these institutions, by taking part in them, by serving them, the things that build the scaffolding and give us all access to the good life, and for those of us who are Catholics, hopefully the life beyond that. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Tim Carney. So now it's time for our Q&A portion. So please just raise your hands and I will give you the mic so that the folks from Facebook, very quick hand. Thank you, sir.
It's a very good overview. You mentioned that at the very beginning that beer drinking timeline was especially interesting to me because that is when suburbanization started. You mentioned that suburban sprawl being part of the problem. You used to be you could walk to the bar and walk to the church. Now you can do neither. But what about entertainment? That's also when TV came along. And now, of course, we have Netflix and we have, computers that you can get any kind of movie you want onto at any time. I mean, we're sort of, seems to me, saturated with entertainment. What can we do about that?
And entertainment that's not communal in any way. And so, I mean, I shouldn't say in any way. People get together afterwards, and at the water cooler, you talk about Game of Thrones. People have viewing party, certainly for a Super Bowl. But yes, the ability, especially now, with the ability to have a bespoke entertainment menu, it certainly does have an effect of tearing us apart. And social media as well. Now, the thing about social media, it's got the word social in there. I do think it has the possibility, and it does at times, serve a good in that it can be a tool to help people come together. But I'm old-fashioned enough to think that ultimately a community, and we use Zuckerberg and Facebook like to use those words as far as virtual communities. I think ultimately a community has to serve these sociological purposes, have these good outcomes, has to be a physically proximate community. So I don't think TV and other forms of entertainment can do that very well. But I do think other forms of social media can, if we as a society sort of get back on our feet and react to the sort of the shock that is the entrance of these things into our society. But yeah, so 1960 to 1965 was probably the peak in sort of civic connectiveness, is what Putnam argues. and there were already trends towards individualism. Yuval Levin argues that there was a good reason, that there was a little too much sort of national cohesion and not enough individualism immediately when the war ended. Lots of interesting things to discuss there, but yes, you do look at what happened. You had television, suburbanization, sexual revolution, all happen around then, and I do think that all of those created both the centralization and the atomization.
Okay, I have two questions, and they're both those kind of questions where the questioner is basically arguing for something and wanting you to say whether...
Good.
Okay, so the first question is, in terms of solutions, not for people like us who are likely to be inspired by your book to volunteer in parish sports, but for people in Uniontown, wouldn't the most bang for your buck come from every little bit of rollback that you could get in entitlements and welfare spending? Because entitlements and welfare spending are what, including Social Security, which, I mean, I'm going to take my Social Security check, absolutely, right? But I also see that Social Security has destroyed intergenerational relationships that existed, because without government money, people desperately need each other. They need their families, they need their religion, they need their churches, they need their community. That's question number one. And then question number two is, you know, the communitarians, the Lutherans, the people who still go to church voted for Donald Trump a lot less than the angry rednecks whose lives are dysfunctional. On the other hand, in world historical terms, we don't look to Germans and Lutherans for healthy political culture. We look to them for they're great at business, they're great at manufacturing, they're great at private life, but they stink at politics. Whereas the people with the best accomplishments in world history in politics are a bunch of angry Anglo-Saxons and Scotch-Irish whose personal lives are a disaster. And, you know, I'm one of these descended from English and Scotch-Irish people. I voted for Donald Trump, and I think my vote was right, even if my private life maybe isn't as good as that of a Lutheran.
First of all, I talk about the Scots-Irish here because the 10% of Americans, I probably told you this, 10% of Americans, when asked their ancestry, you know, the 4% say Dutch, some large percentage say German, 10% just say American. Not Native American, just American. But we actually know that they're mostly Scots-Irish, is the funniest thing. And that was the biggest predictor, one of the biggest predictors of the Trump vote was a percentage of a county that identified as American. I argue in here that that's a sign of deracination. These people, they've lost tradition, they've lost religion, and so then they turn to somebody who they think can fix it. And my argument is, no, he can't fix it. The same way people turn to Bernie because they think he can fix it through socialism. If we just have a strong enough guy or caring enough federal government, they can fix it. No, what's going to fix it is, well, I would start, if we're going to start at home, I would start with our church being more like the Mormons and more like the Dutch Reformed in that we care every day about the corporal works of mercy, care every day about building the infrastructure that supports family and that sort of thing. The Dutch Reformed tend to be one of the most conservative electorates, and if I were to accuse them them and the Mormons of any problem, it would be in not knowing that we talk about the elite bubbles, not knowing that outside of their bubbles, like the American dream really was dead, and I didn't know that until going to Smitty's, and so that's the only sort of political crime I would commit. I would charge them with. On the safety net, if you just pull it away, like tomorrow, pass the bill to end so much of the safety net, I think you're killing people even more than the current situation is, because the safety net has already done the work of crowding out the human level local safety net. I mean, Social Security, FDR he basically said, and I've got the quote in the book, well, people used to rely on their children when they get old, and now they can rely on me. That was effectively part of his pitch. And it's worked well enough that you can't just pull it away. So the way I describe the safety net approach there is the federal safety net should be as much as possible channeled through it, not that way, because asking for federal money and churches and organizations asking for trouble. The federal safety net should be a safety net of safety nets. So wherever possible, the safety net should be administered by voluntary local organizations, followed by a state. It's what I think subsidiarity prescribed. Then finally followed by the federal programs, which should be a safety net of safety nets. So if you're describing an ideal situation without these federal programs, I agree. But as far as a step moving forward, I don't think you can pull it away because the institutions, the family, is so eroded.
Next question.
Thank you. I have a comment posing as a question, okay? I recently returned from Europe, and although I didn't go to Notre Dame this time, I guess I won't be going back again, at least to the same site. But I did visit the cathedral at Cologne, and it was remarkable, absolutely stunning. If any of you have been there, the magnificence of the architecture taking hundreds of years and thousands of lives to build. And yet they stand there, the great cathedrals and edifices of our faith, our common faith, whether we're Catholic or Protestant or Christian. The edifice to our common faith sits there old, cold, and largely empty. People who are there are not there for the same reasons for which that monument was built. They are there to take pictures, to chit-chat, take notes, and to be seen and take selfies, basically. The problem is Europe, the United States to a lesser degree, and much of what was the Christian world suffers from a consequence of what you have described, apparently, in your book and what you're discussing here, and that is a lack of faith in itself as well as in its God. So we're below, not at, but below zero population growth, meaning we are diminishing in numbers to the point of extinction if extrapolated far enough. So my question is, how do we reverse this without words, with action? How do we reverse this trend with action? Or is an external existential threat necessary to awaken those kinds of passions that stimulated Urban II rather than Franny the Red? Excuse me.
So I'm going to get even more depressing than you. And I'm frankly the part where I'm going to get emotional. But first, the sort of almost humorous, depressing part was one line in a story I read about why nobody was injured in the fire at Notre Dame was, well, the church was almost empty because they had cleared it out for mass. So it was almost empty because it was mass time. So that line right there, that tells you, still a nice tourist attraction, but they kicked the tourists out and it was only the worshipers who were left there on Holy Week. And it was almost empty. I told you it was funny and dark at the same time. So the first thing our church has to do is stop being evil. So I'm going to get emotional here. I'm gonna skip the long version of it and just say our hierarchy protected rapists and has not shown any willingness to change. I was at St. Matthew's on the day after the Pennsylvania report came out, the noon mass. So walking there with some colleagues. Normally, this is the Mass Cardinal Worrell would say, but there's no way he's going to say it now. Sure enough, he walks out there. And, for the mea culpa, something about watching him gingerly tap his chest, I realized what I wanted then was for him to break his own ribs in repentance. It's not there. So I can blame Barack Obama and we can blame FDR, but as long as we're in this room, we should say it's got to start with our own church, and there's plenty else to do. There are evil forces in the state, in culture. There's the devil. All of these things that are out there, but the devil's also in here, and that's the first place that we have to start.
Okay, we have time for one more question.
Thank you so much, first of all. The Irish bar is a niche population. Did you have an opportunity, or will you have an opportunity, to take a look at the communities that exist in the Muslim community?
Yeah.
In the Polish community? The Polish
Yeah.
community you'll find in an Irish bar. But the Baha'is, the other folks who are
Yeah.
not part of the mainstream.
No, that's a great question. I have multiple sections on the Muslims. I ended up at a place, just saying the word would have made me, the name of this place would have made me laugh before I knew about it. The Islamic Center of Greater Toledo. And if you know Toledo, you know that there's a large, I think it was the Arab Christian population that moved there, and then the Arab Muslim population. And so one of the things about the Islamic Center of Greater Toledo is a woman said the phrase, we want it to be more than just, the woman who runs it, we want it to be more than just a masjid. And masjid just means house of worship. And she was talking about how on Sunday, every Sunday, they just have a giant community potluck. And if a new Muslim moves to Toledo, they're just told, go to the Greater Islamic Center on Sunday, and that's where you'll meet everybody. Meet the person who's going to find you a couch to sleep on, meet the person who's renting out a house, meet the person who can hire you, figure out which mosque you want to attend Jummah at. But it's interesting because I've spent a little bit of time reading, intra-Muslim debates online, and there's a sort of a fundamentalist idea that a mosque should only be a house of worship. It shouldn't allow anything else to go on in the same building. But that fundamentalist idea is also Nancy Pelosi's idea, right? That the church should just be, and Obama's idea, the church should just be worship. And I think that what the Catholic Church is supposed to be, that what Christ built it for was to not just be a house of worship, but so I saw in those, another interesting statistic is that Muslim Americans have a higher optimism about the future of the country. They have more, this is polls taken after Trump comes into office, they have more belief that with hard work you can get ahead than does the average American. And I interpret that as this. The Muslim Americans are religious Americans, and religious Americans are more hopeful and believe more in the American dream. So I do have that. I have some discussion of the Orthodox, modern Orthodox, and the more Haredi in there. But I think there's a lot of stories to tell. I didn't get into.
Does not totally go to bar.
I also go to church. That's actually how I describe this is somebody said, well, is it a lot like Charles Murray's book or J.D. Vance's book? I said it's similar to Charles Murray's Coming Apart or J.D. Vance's Hillbilly Elegy, but with a lot more bars and a lot more church. But also mosques and synagogues and all that. Anyway, guys, I want to thank you all very much for listening to me. Thank you.